What does luxury mean to you?
Luxury. In India, I discovered that true luxury isn't something you buy off a shelf. True luxury is a feeling that you are the Maharani of your world. And it can be all designed around you. All the beauty is yours. All the music is yours. India showed me that luxury doesn't follow designers and brands. True luxury follows its own heart.
Incredible India.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you once again on this fourth day of the 7-day lecture series on the books based on princely states of Gujarat. Today, we take you on a kaleidoscopic journey of wall paintings and miniature paintings in the pre-independent Gujarat states. My name is Dr. Maitree Vaidya Sabnis. I am one of the chief editors of the 3-book series on the princely states of Gujarat. Just for your information, the Kindle copies of the books are available on Amazon.in. The hard copies of the books will also be available soon on pothi.com. There are 3 lectures today. The first one focuses on Baroda State, Maharaja Sayajirao Gaekwad III, Patronage of Painters by Dr. Kenneth X. Robbins and myself. The second lecture is again by Dr. Kenneth X. Robbins, and he is going to speak on miniature paintings of princely states such as Bhavnagar, Junagadh, Palanpur, Radhanpur, and Sachin. These so far have been outside the periphery of the general discourse. The third lecture is by Mr. Vineet Vyas, who is going to speak on another marginalized, or let's say unheard artist of Jamnagar, Shri Kadiya Rupa Kachra. With the permission of the host, I will now begin my lecture. Do I have the permission?
Please continue. Please continue.
Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about Sayaji Rao's life and his reforms. But before I do that, we have to talk about the 18th century and the political turmoil that ensued. So geopolitical reformation of Gujarat as a region happened in the 18th century with the decline of the Mughal Empire. Many historians view the 18th century as that of a political chaos, hence that of a social and economic decline. However, Gujarat, along with other regions, does not showcase any signs of anarchy in this period. The new Cambridge historians or the revisionists, in fact, showcase an economic growth that the decline brought. Economic growth was because of the rise of multiple regional powers that gradually rose up in position of influence in every region by the second half of the 18th century. Hence continued the collection of revenue, hence continued the rural economic measures, and hence continued the buying and selling of products, both internal trade as well as thriving external trade or international trade. In case of Gujarat, there were multiple parties present within the region, primarily being the Peshwa, and of course their deputies, such as the Dabhades and the Gaekwads. By the mid-18th century, Gaekwads were able to oust other Maratha Sardars from Gujarat, along with multiple parties, such as the Nizam of Hyderabad or the representative of Nizam of Hyderabad and the Mughal viceroy. They also made political alliances with local powers, such as the Thakurs, Rajas of smaller Rajwadas, local village headmen, such as Patels and Desais, also the Nawab of Surat and the Mughal viceroys. So with them, they continued to form alliances, break alliances, continued to fight bigger and smaller battles. But by 1761, when the Third Battle of Panipat was fought between Ahmad Shah Abdali and Marathas, it gave a setback to the growing Maratha powers. In all of this, Damaji Rao Gaekwad, of course, is the one who's gaining power and influence. He established greater control over the regions, particularly north of the river Mahi. They also entered into tributary relationships with the other smaller chieftains and began to collect arbitrary tribute as far as Kathiawar. At some point of time, they obtained revenue collecting rights of Amreli in Kathiawar, which is a western Gujarat. So Amreli became a part of Baroda State. Kadi in the north of Gujarat was another region which they directly controlled. Navsari in the south of Gujarat came to them when they signed a partition treaty with the Peshwa in 1751. Baroda or Vadodara division became the headquarters of the Gaekwads by the end of the 18th century. This way, although the state was formed, but its districts were scattered and its boundaries were incongruous. This, however, did not come in the way of the rulers to introduce reforms. The consolidation process of Baroda State took place in the 19th century, especially with the coming of the British in the political scene. The Subsidiary Alliance Treaty was signed between the Gaekwad and the company officials, English East India Company officials, and that's when we can see the beginning of establishment of British paramountcy. So thus began the process of crystallization of regions. The company's government was able to establish paramount relationship with the Gaekwad, but the relationship was not always cordial. For instance, Sayaji Rao II had tremendous problems with the high-handedness of the British officials, and the friction between them escalated to a point when the Bombay government was forced to withdraw residency from the city of Baroda for a temporary period of time. His namesake, that is Maharaja Sayajirao III, also had a similar love-hate relationship with the Indian government or the colonial government. Now, Sayaji Rao, who was renamed after he was adopted, was born as Gopal Rao to Kashi Rao Gaekwad in Kavlan village in present-day Maharashtra. At the time, Maharaja Khande Rao was ruling in Baroda State. Unfortunately, the Maharaja Khande Rao died in 1870 at a young age, leaving a pregnant young widow, Jamnabai, who later gave birth to a daughter. Since the Maharaja had no male heir, therefore, the reign passed into the hands of his younger brother, Malhar Rao Gaekwad. Now, Malhar Rao's reign of 5 years was quite controversial, as he could not get along with either the English resident stationed in Baroda city or the elites of the society. Towards the end of it, the Maharaja was deposed, leaving the throne and the rule of Baroda State to its fate. Maharani Jamnabai resurfaced. In fact, some believe that she was quite instrumental in bringing down Malhar Rao. She used her Kharita, which was the right of adoption given to Khande Rao Gaekwad when he had assisted the English troops during the revolt of 1857. So she used that Kharita given to her husband and revoked the right of adoption. She chose young Gopal Rao as the next Maharaja of Baroda and named him Sayaji Rao III. The Viceroy of India, since the boy was only 12 years old, so therefore the Indian government and the Bombay government together, they decided to control the state through establishment of a minority administration. So they appointed Sir T. Madhav Rao as the new Diwan of Baroda State. The Diwan T. Madhav Rao set the path for the young Maharaja to walk on by introducing progressive reforms in the state. Maharaja Sayajirao was trained by English tutors under the program of Mission Civilisatris. However, he was more closer to his roots than the paramount power liked. He came in constant indirect conflict with the colonial government when he acceded to the Gadi in 1881. The Darbar incident of 1911 is one such instance where he apparently deliberately broke the prescribed protocol while paying his respects to King of England. He faced ridicule by international by the international press and was persecuted by the Indian government for a long time. However, this did not deter him in following through with his designs. Sayaji Rao continued to express his nationalist leanings and carried out many reforms in the state. So far as his economic reforms are concerned, he initiated a vigorous policy of industrial and agricultural developments. He held a number of exhibitions showing to the people the latest developments in industrial machinery, agricultural implements, seeds and plants, textile goods, leather work, so on and on. He set up a technical college called Kala Bhavan in 1890, which is still functional and is known as the Faculty of Technology today, and gave admission to the members of the artisan and quote-unquote untouchable castes. This was much against the wishes of the high caste Hindus. The Baroda government, under his guidance, offered wastelands for cultivation at lower rates, granted advances to the agriculturalists on easy terms, and encouraged new methods of cultivation by setting up model experimental farms. In 1882, Sayaji Rao set up a cotton textile mill and in 1884, a sugar factory. These state enterprises were pioneered with the declared intention to hand over their management and control to a private party at a suitable time. Without Sayaji Rao's grants of generous concessions, the famous Alembic chemical works, which could not have been established in 1907. Bank of Baroda, in fact, also was established with the efforts of the Maharaja. So it was established in 1908, and he managed to convince a lot of the elites in the society who earlier were financiers of the government, and he had employed an American, Captain Whitnack, to look into the matters, to persuade the sahukars, that is the moneylenders, to invest in the bank. And that's how Bank of Baroda was first opened in Baroda, and now it is an international bank. When we talk about his social reforms, the Maharaja established a number of educational institutions, starting from Baroda College in 1890, which went on to become the prestigious Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda. He made strenuous efforts to ameliorate the conditions of tribes, women, and other oppressed sections. Very few people know that Maharaja Sayaji Rao was one of the pioneering reformers in India who strove to improve the condition of Dalits in the society. In fact, he integrated the reforms in his policy itself. However, he's been criticized because he could not follow it through. He really could not persuade his people belonging to upper caste to really accept the laws made by him or suggestions given by him. Nonetheless, he kept on trying. When we talk about cultural reforms, in cultural matters too, the Gaekwad was an instrument of change. For instance, to popularize Indian classical music, he founded the music school in 1886, today which is known as the Faculty of Performing Arts. And he invited renowned musicians to teach music to aspiring young budding musicians. The details which we have written in one of the articles of the book. The Maharaja also patronized many artists, including painters such as Ravi Varma and others, which my good friend, Dr. Robbins, will be speaking on next. The reforms of Sayaji Rao III were so many that we would need another 7-day series of lectures to really understand the kind of work that he carried out. Due to paucity of time, I have mentioned only few. So without wasting much time, may I request Dr. Robbins to speak on how Maharaja Sayaji Rao III contributed in creating a conducive cultural environment in the state. I thank you all for giving me a patient hearing. Dr. Robbins, please.
Thank you very much. Let's see, do we have the video up? So what Dr. Maitree has told you is a small village boy comes to a kingdom that was, a Maratha kingdom. The Marathas were known for their military and political acumen, and not for particularly for the patronage of the arts. So this village boy who is taken out of what's Maharashtra today is taken to Baroda, and he creates a whole set of modernization activities in a cultured city. This includes high art, handicrafts, performing arts, royal possessions, and so on and so forth. What is amazing is almost everybody that he touched turned out to be somebody great. And very often they went from one thing to the other. The fellow that he trained in print became the founder of the Indian movie industry. The leader that he picked, who became Aurobindo, did not start in yoga, but he started in political and other affairs. So he picked people who were visionaries and creative people. He used to broaden their vision by cross-referencing, performing literary, religious traditions. And he wasn't one of these people who took something out of the blue from the West and in a rootless way, just plopped it down there. He favored collaboration and hybridity. He saw India as a place that was enduring, but not timeless and unchanging. He made Baroda an alternate center for development and modernization. He patronized artists, performers, advisors, administrators, and created a sustained creative frame of mind, which have influenced many in Baroda and created the magnificent MS University. This is an amazing set of accomplishments that he had. Now, like many Maharajas, he had all sorts of jewels, and we put in the article, there was this pearls that fetched $7 million in 2007, and so on and so forth. But his greatest jewels, now Akbar Swami had 9 jewels, but Sayaji Rao had so many jewels. There were the painters like Ravi Varma and Fyzee Rahamin, the sculptures like Felici, the musicians, the singers. And the singers were all different types. Gandharva, who played female roles, and the singer Ayaz Khan. And again, the people went from one thing to another. There were musicians like Hazrat Inayat Khan, who went to America and founded all sorts of Western Sufi movements and is influenced in Sufi circles. But he started as a musician with Sayaji Rao. And Dr. Maitree has mentioned the technocrats who founded the Bank of Baroda, his promotion of industry, and so on and so forth. And who can forget Ambedkar? So if all of these people were his jewels, his jewel box was the Baroda Museum and Picture Gallery, the Fateh Singh Museum, and the Kirti Mandir. His art projects allowed for Indians to enter aesthetic and artistic dialogues with the West. And I myself have been very interested in the way one of the musicians, Hazrat Inayat Khan, whose theories about Sufism and the universal sound had global effects on spirituality and music, especially on jazz music in the United States. One of the people that he promoted very heavily was Ravi Varma. Now, what this talks to is the pan-Indian tradition that the Maharajas created. In the case of somebody like Sayaji Rao, there were influences from other Maratha states. For example, his first wife bringing Tanjore musicians and dancers from another Maratha state. But we also see things from non-Maratha states. Ravi Varma, of course, came from the royal family of Travancore. And we see one of the paintings and the way in which this painting has created all sorts of other variations. I think that this talks to the Indian genius for incorporating things at high levels, high aesthetic levels, and at the popular level. We see on the right-hand side 2 postcard and a poster variation on this painting. In the lower left-hand side, we see that somebody has taken the image and put all sorts of embroidery and fabric all over it and recreated and layered this image. So the poster is a multi-layered thing, half a creation of an artist and half a creation of the patron. And in a final postcard, we see that the image has been taken for a Christian image as well as from the Hindu image. But the Christian image has been Indianized by using the work of Raja Ravi Varma. This gives you some idea of the scope of the influences. Today, I want to talk to you about one of the most important forgotten painters. This is Fyzee Rahamin and his wife, Atiya Begum. Fyzee Rahamin was belonging to the small Beni Israel community in Maharashtra. On the marriage to a member related to the Tayabshi family, he took on a Muslim name, Fyzee Rahamin, and he then went to work in a number of different ways. His early work was very academic, westernized work. Now, when you go in to the Fateh Singh Museum, created by the royal family of Baroda, the first thing that hits you is 6 paintings by Fyzee Rahamin. When you look at the paintings that were patronized by the royal family in the Baroda Art Museum, you'll find that there are a number of paintings in a totally different style, also by Fyzee Rahamin. I wondered where some of these paintings have wound up. The picture of the Maharani of Kutch, Bihar, the daughter of Sayaji Rao. It's a very good picture, and I don't know where where it's wound up. Fyzee also created a mural for the lintel of what was the Maharaja's Durbar room for women. And he also created a Nach scene at the court, which I'll show you. But the major thing is that when you go to the Fateh Singh Museum, Fyzee's portraits of the Gaekwad, his famous feminist wife, Chinmabai II, who you see on the right-hand side, and his 4 sons are prominently displayed in the first gallery. Sayaji Rao also was the patron of Fyzee's wife. Fyzee's wife was Atiya Begum. She was a musicologist. And here's the picture of her wedding. At her wedding, to the right of the bride, we see Sayaji Rao. And to whose right, we see the Habshi Nawab of Janjira, who also had a dependency called Jafrabad in Gujarat. This Nawab was married to Atiya's sister. So in other words, Atiya and Fyzee were in-laws of the Nawab of Janjira. In another book, I've written how that all played out later, and Fyzee wound up using his sister-in-law's diatribe to Queen Mary to write a feminist novel in the 1930s. This is a Muslim man writing a feminist novel in the 1930s. And that's in another book that I've just put out called African Rulers and Generals in India. But let me tell you a little about Fyzee's wife. Begum Atiya was known as a leading feminist of India. She came from the first family, aristocratic family, to come out of seclusion. And she became a great authority on Hindu music. When she wrote her masterpiece of Hindu music, of course, it was illustrated by Ragamala paintings. These Ragamala paintings done in a neo-traditional style were done by her husband, Fyzee Rahamin. Here's one of them on the left. Now, where does Sayaji Rao come in to all this thing? Sayaji Rao created an all India music conference in Baroda in 1916. And you can see all the great theorists of music came, and they were trying to found a central academy, not only for training, but to preserve and document Indian music and the rags and so on and so forth. Fyzee, in the meanwhile, had moved in different ways. From this very academic style in which he portrayed the Gaekwad, he moved to a slightly different style. You can see this in the Nach dance at Baroda. But I'm particularly intrigued by his paintings, his religious paintings. Well, just consider this man's history. He was born into an indigenous small Indian Jewish community, became a Muslim, and who does he paint? He paints Buddha and Krishna. In the painter in the upper right, you can barely see, but there's an outline of Krishna, and there's it's a meditation on Krishna. And the one on the left-hand side in the middle of the screen is, of course, Buddha. But the most interesting painting is his painting of the Water Maid, which shows religious figures from many traditions. You see Jewish, Buddhist, Parsi, and so on and so forth. I think this is an important Indian painting that we have to find it and really do some research on it. And this is the last slide. He was also a playwright, and they did plays all over England. One of them was Daughter of Ind with music by Atiyah. So that's the story of Fyzee Rahamin and Atiyah, and how just one of the many, many people who were patronized by Sayaji Rao. While I'm getting up my next thing, I think we should have a few questions, Maitree, if we could. Maitree, would you take over and have a few questions? I'll set up my screen in the meantime.
Yes, maybe we can take few questions. So, or maybe observations if anyone wants to comment. So what we have done is we've done a paper. In fact, we've written an article in the third volume in our books. So if you want to read more in detail about it, you might have to buy the book. But essentially, we have tried to look at, since I don't know how many of you know, but Baroda is known as the Sanskari Nagari, as the title suggests. So Sanskari Nagari, it means cultural city. So it is also known as the cultural city of Gujarat. So the reason, Ken was quite curious to see as to why is it called a cultural city. And obviously, if you ever happen to come to Baroda, then you will automatically, if you're coming by train, so as soon as you come out of the railway station, you find this beautiful Faculty of Arts. And it is a building which was constructed in 1890. It was called as Baroda College. It has got a beautiful dome. And you just would not be really helped but getting enamored by the building. So it's only a start. So you can go to Kirti Mandir, you can travel to different parts of Baroda city, the main area, and then you'll see that how beautiful the buildings are. So not only buildings, but you can visit museums, and there you will see different painters that Sayaji Rao had patronized. So Ken was talking about Raja Ravi Varma. I'm sure many of you would have heard of him. And in fact, it is believed that he was the one who gave faces to the goddesses, or to the Indian Hindu goddesses. So especially he was the one who gave face to the Bharat Mata, the image of Bharat Mata. So it is a belief of many that he was responsible for that. So apart from that, Sayaji Rao also was quite keen on not only giving patronization or sponsoring the Indian artists, but he is also known to have sponsored some Western art and artists as well. So if you come to Baroda and if you visit Lakshmi Vilas Palace, I'm sure Ken will tell you about the kind of collection that the palace has of different paintings. And even the museum, the Baroda Museum, also houses a whole lot of paintings. Fateh Singh Museum also houses beautiful paintings. Some of the works are done by Italian artists. So if you can throw some light on that?
Right, I think we can move on to, if I can screen share here.
Okay. Okay, so I think Ken is ready with his next part of the lecture. So he's going to talk about wall and miniature paintings in the princely states of Gujarat.
Well, I know I'm using the princely states title with because that's what we commonly use it, but I think it's a term that's going to be obsolete. And I know if Dr. Maitree has her way, she's going to do everything scholarly to help us move past that unfortunate term. What we have is a situation here where if you talk about to collectors of miniature paintings, they will tell you about paintings from Rajasthan, from places like Mewar or Kishingar or Kota. They will talk about Pahari paintings, places that nobody else has ever heard of. They're not unimportant, like Kangra and Guler and Jasroda and so on and so forth. But respect and study for the wall and miniature paintings of Gujarat has been lacking. I think that this is very unfair and unfortunate. I picked up an encyclopedia of Indian wall painting. I could barely lift it, and there wasn't a single wall painting from Gujarat. How could this be? How can we not recognize that there were styles and so on and so forth? And yet you would think that these paintings would be better known. For example, the paintings related to the Swami Narayan movement, which is one of the areas that we concentrate on the book, and you'll hear Veena talking about this. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of problems with my getting my. Now you've seen all my slides, but for some reason I need to start over again. I'm having trouble. I had trouble the other day as well with. So so you say, first of all, were wall paintings very, very, very common? You wouldn't think so if nobody is mentioned. But if you go look at any area of Gujarat, whether it's major cities or villages, you find the wall paintings all over the place. And so we put in some maps of where wall paintings have been found. The Kutch area is a particularly fertile area. And we see this in an Englishman's background bungalow, McMurdo's bungalow, which is the upper left in Anjar. Then we see it in the upper right in the Monastery. And then we see in the three paintings in the middle from a temple still in Kutch, and at the bottom in a private residence in Kutch. One of the problems with these Kutch paintings is that not only have they not been studied, but there are only 3 places now in Kutch with well-preserved paintings, wall paintings of the Kavanagari school. We see in the lower left painting from Tara Fort of the Ramayana. What was particularly upsetting was the damaging of the Darbagah at Jamnagar, which is an amazing thing. I'm going to be able to show you some pictures from there, but some of the pictures are of poor quality, but they were only the pictures we could get. And to make it even more ridiculous, we're seeing the loss of a lot of paintings in temples. For example, a particular set of paintings in Hafwar Mahadev temple were submerged. And they're seen on the right-hand side. So we wanted this book to preserve a lot of these things that nobody's going to see again. Also, we see that these paintings are being transformed so that they look quite different. Now, this is a Swami Narayan temple, two Swami Narayan paintings in a Swami Narayan temple in Batal village. Now, the upper left is the way both of these paintings were originally painted. But some of the paintings have been totally redone in a totally different style, which I find attractive, but it's still a totally different style. But you can see both styles there. And so they appear very different than the originals. And I will go over one other example of this. And so the paintings at religious shrines could be examined by art historians to document additions and changes over time. And this has been done in India already in other sites outside of Gujarat. Even in, the studies of the Ajanta caves. What also struck me as very strange, everybody knows about Jain cloth paintings, Jain miniature paintings of the Kalpa Sutra and things like that. But there must be paintings on the walls of Jain shrines in Gujarat. So if we're paying attention to palm leaves and paper and cloth and so on and so forth, and Jain sculptures, why do we barely look at whether there are paintings there or not there? And there are at least some modern paintings still being made in the Jain tradition. So the question in my mind is, why do we study things and why do we not study things? Some of these temple paintings could be studied because they have particular subjects of interest. For example, there's the Raghunath temple in Patron, which was an ancient capital of Gujarat, and was later in Baroda State. A 19th century merchant built this temple, and there are paintings related to Ram. But look at these other paintings showing the planets, showing astrological symbols, and the one that I liked very much was in the lower right-hand side, depicting medical disorders and causes of death. This is a particular interest to me because in 1995, I did an exhibit on medicine in Maharaja's medical pluralism for the National Library of Medicine, Bethesda, and Columbia University. These paintings, as we see them, have references to outside paintings. And one of the things we're not doing enough when we talk about style in paintings, we talk about style as if it exists in a pure form in any particular place. Now here we see paintings at a monastery in Kutch. Was built by a merchant in 1831. And the walls are covered with oil paintings. It's dedicated to an ascetic whose anger caused an earthquake which destroyed the village and dried up the sea. But you see, the painting on the upper left is taken from a Ravi Varma print that the local painter in Than utilized for his temple. We also can get a lot of history out of these paintings. This is a painting on the top of the Swami Narayan movement, and you see all the disciples, and we can name who these disciples were and what their relationship was with the Baroda government. One of them was the bane of Baroda as leader of a, quote, criminal gang. And we see the disciples, other disciples leading small states, and two Kathi rulers and the relationship between the Kathis and the Rajputs is an area, and the conflicts and so on and so forth is an area of concern to military and political historians. But here we can see how these people lived in relationship to the Swami Narayan movement. At the bottom, we have images from the Swami Narayan temple in Gondal. This painting is so magnificent, so incredibly magnificent, and yet, you know, the whole thing is not known at all. In the palaces too, we see all sorts of wall paintings that have not been studied. The Jam Sahibs were Janika Rajputs, and they felt that they were upheld Rajput honor. They fought several battles, and according to them, they captured Mughal standards and 150 elephants and 60 guns and so on and so forth. But they were very proud of the military traditions. And the battle that's talked about in the caption to that photograph is illustrated on a wall painting. What's also interesting is the way when you look at the wall paintings in Jamnagar, the capital of Nalanagar, you see the intermingling of local painterly traditions and idioms from outside of Gujarat. The paintings on the left are wall paintings in Jamnagar. The painting on the upper right is a painting from an artist called Pimji, which is quite a bit earlier, from Ajmer, which is very far from Jamnagar. And the bottom caricatures are from Jammu. So you can begin to see the pan-Indic traditions going across borders, like state borders or regional borders like Gujarat or Rajasthan. I was particularly interested in the wall paintings in the old capital of Bhavnagar, a place called Sihar. You go up to the top of this old wooden building, and you find the walls are covered with these wonderful wall paintings, which have been repainted to some extent. Now, the Maharaja, for the wedding of his daughter, also had artists copy these paintings in a different way. I haven't found the originals of the copies, and they were used for a set of playing cards. And included in the playing cards was documentation of Bhavnagar's history. And so now we can tell you all about the various battles that they fought against the Kathis. And in the book, we document all this while we're discussing the paintings. So if you want to understand the problems that the Maharajas of Bhavnagar faced with Kathis and their own clansmen, you can understand it by reading this chapter. Also, we found there were large paintings that were done in places like Kutch for a festival, and this is painted by a Muslim artist. And many of these artists, even though they painted Hindu themes, were Muslims. Also neglected are the wall paintings in places like Baroda, at the residence of one of the Gaekwad's prime ministers. Right in Baroda city, there's this magnificent residence with hundreds of wall paintings of all sorts. Oops, having the same problem with my. So what are these styles? You see on the upper two paintings are paintings of the rulers of Baroda, and the bottom four paintings are pictures of Krishna and Vishnu. So we see battle scenes, we see the involvement of the British in these paintings, and we see even erotic art and portraits of Europeans. But I think that the Krishna paintings and Vishnavite paintings are particularly of interest. And one can see here Krishna with the gopis, Krishna with the gopis' clothes, Vishnu resting on serpent, and the Gaja Moksha, the Vishnu coming in to release the king of the elephants. There are also paintings, miniature paintings from schools that nobody has really tackled. This is a Durbar scene from Bhavnagar. There's no article in the literature about Bhavnagar paintings. It's kind of miniature paintings. It's a painting, one of two-sided paintings of the mid-17th century that probably came from somewhere near Wadwan. We don't really know where. These paintings were formerly my connection, but they're now in the Brooklyn Museum. And we need to study these early paintings and see if we can place them better than we did in the past. This is a painting that I use all the time. It's one of my favorite paintings. It's a painting from my collection of Kutch, and I particularly like it because it shows the Africans that I've studied elsewhere. When I go through my collection of rare books, what I'm interested in doing is I've tried to build up an archive of material that nobody else collects. And that archive is going to University of Pennsylvania eventually. The idea is, if you come up with a novel subject, to see what you have that you wouldn't get from the usual sources. And so by looking at these books, I found paintings of Palampur and paintings of Junagadh, schools that have not been studied at all. There also, we need to study the paintings for the Muslim Nawabs of Radanpur and Junagadh, and start compared with those produced for Rajput Maharajas in nearby states. And we know that the painters, the Nawab of Radanpur, so the best artists and musicians from other states. So they include works by Rajasthani and Kutchi artists. So this puts into question the whole idea of discrete schools of paintings. Artists traveled from place to place, depending on patronage. And here are some fine paintings of Radanpur, the collection of Amit Ambalal in Ahmedabad. Also, unfortunately, I wasn't able to get this manuscript. This is an early 19th century manuscript that has not only rulers, but Sufis, that was made by another Habshi ruler, the Nawab of Sachin, which is near Surat. And this shows the Nawab on the left-hand side. And here are two other paintings from this manuscript. One is Sufi text and the other a Mughal emperor. Then one of the questions that I asked myself is, there's so many different Srinathji paintings that we get from Kangroli and Nathdwara. And there's so many Nathdwara Srinathji shrines in Gujarat. Where are the paintings? I think they are there. I think they just haven't identified and figured them out. So I put in a poster from Ahmedabad, but we need to see the painters that came. And I spoke to Madhavanti Ghosh about this, and she said there are definitely such paintings. But the one that I like the best, because it's totally different, is a panel from the wall paintings in Jamnagar, which, not only show the Jam Sahib with one of the early Goswamis of the Srinathji movement of the Pushti Marg, but show a lot of other religious paintings. And I think the most interesting job has been done by Vinit, who will be speaking next, because he will be talking to you about the way in which these artists went back and forth between religious patrons and Maharajas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Robbins. So we have a lot of questions here, some observations, some questions. So I will read the first question. So this is for both of us. This is from our one of the editors, Dr. William. So he's asked, you have both mentioned Sayaji Rao's having been adopted. Do you regard his outstanding career as being in spite of his humble beginnings or because of them. So basically, I think I can speak on behalf of Ken as well, that Sayaji Rao III was adopted at the age of 12. Until then, he was a farmer's son. So he was fairly closer to the mitti, as we call it, the soil, than the other rulers of his age or older than him, that is his contemporaries. So since he was quite close to his roots, so therefore he was able to understand the problems of the rural areas of his state, and therefore the first measures that he undertakes, he decides to travel to the rural parts of Baroda State. He sees their plight and he decides to carry out radical reforms for them. So yes, and secondly, so far as his response to the treatment that was given out to him by the paramount power, definitely if you'd want to read more about it, you can read it. I'm sure you already know that his grandson, great-grandson, Fateh Singh Rao, has written a book which is called as The Prince and the Man. So in this book, he showcases how young Sayaji Rao would have, in fact, he had felt, and how he responded. He found a father figure and a friend in F.A.H. Eliot, his tutor, and how he would, in his letters that were exchanged between both of them when Eliot was away, he constantly wrote about the problems that he was facing, and he could not comprehend, he could not really take the treatment so easily. So he was quite close to his roots and to his people. So I think there are also other observations given out by other participants. So for instance, Usha Vijay-Lakshmi in fact says that she can think of the adopted son of Shahu of Kolhapur. So I think that would answer your question. Then there's another question by Gitika Rathore. So she asks that, is there a connection between religious art and non-religious art? So Ken, would you like to address that?
I think I'm going to leave that one to Vinit, because he's talking about it specifically about an artist who worked in both. And I think that we should come back to that question. I think it's a very good question. But I think one of the difficulties that we have is in looking at art and looking at the artist. For example, if you look at some of the Mughal paintings, you'll find that in a particular Raznama painting, you'll find that the same paintings were done by Muslims and Hindus. You can't really tell the difference by looking at the paintings. And even in more religious areas like Udaipur, you'll see that there's still Muslim artists. And the question about the artist really crossing these religious bounds, especially a Muslim artist, is very interesting to me.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, but there is one thing that really puzzles me whenever I read what I call as the Eurocentric approach. So the whole concept of Hindu artists and the Muslim artists somehow exists in the minds of, if I can say, outsiders, you know, because for a ruler or maybe someone who's commissioning the artwork, the person is an artist, irrespective of what religion or what region or what, let's say, even for that matter, what gender they belong to. So to see everything in that light, you know, looking at it from Hindu or Muslim is something that's again we have to wash away. That's again we have to really not stick to, because it's really it simply doesn't do justice to the people in the time who had existed in the times. So I believe that Hindu and Muslim ideas we need to really revisit and see. So I think yes, please.
But from a Western perspective, you see, you don't understand anything. So the first thing that people want to do, anything you don't understand, is you want to give it a name and say, you know, this is this and this is not this, and to put these categories in. And I mean, I'm working on a book now, and the biggest problem with the book is to include the chapters we need to include a book. You can't come up with a title for it because the audience will determine who buys the book. They'll determine what's going to be in the book and what's not going to be in the book. And I think we should be writing about these areas to the subject, not to the audience. And if you have a Western audience, they will respond to certain things and not other things. And India does not exist just to please outsiders.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think India deserves its rightful place, even if it's in whichever sense, but it deserves its rightful place. We need to change the lens to look at. So far, we've looked at India only from certain angles. Now the lens needs to shift, is what I personally feel. I think there are some more interesting questions, but I think everybody is waiting to listen to Mr. Vineet Vyas. And now may I request Mr. Vineet Vyas to please deliver his lecture, just a little bit about him. So Mr. Vyas works on early modern visual and material culture of South Asia, particularly court and devotional painting traditions. He's graduated in art history from the Department of Art History and Aesthetics, Faculty of Fine Arts of our very own, the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda. He passed out in 2018. Keeping an interdisciplinary approach, he also delves into religious studies, gender and sexuality, languages and text-image relationship. He was a research intern at the Mehergarh Fort Museum in Jodhpur and a visiting teacher of South Asian art history at the National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad. His recent publications include an introductory essay for the 2018 exhibition of Lunacy Between Eternities, and he continues to write public essays on South Asian art. Apart from researching on the early modern painting traditions in Gujarat, he's co-authoring a catalogue of Rajasthani paintings from a private collection. Today, he's speaking on shifting between the courtly and divine, the case of Jamnagar artist Kadiya Rupa Kachra. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Vineet Vyas.
Thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you for inviting Dr. Sabnis, Dr. Robbins, and also the Asiatic Society. I feel very excited to talk about Gujarat because as we have been discussing, it's an area which is quite sadly ignored in terms of visual culture. I'm an art historian, and now I'm finishing my master's in Baroda itself. I hope the screen is visible. So yeah, so I have myself been thinking on, say, 17th to 19th century paintings in Gujarat for a good time now, and there was no material which we were taught or which we even thought around. We would look at Ravi Varma, but Ravi Varma was just an isolated example from Baroda, and of course he remains important, but I never heard of paintings from Bhavnagar, Jamnagar, as Dr. Robbins talked about. And then I had been doing some field work, and it just happened that I did a larger sort of broader project on Swami Narayan painting traditions, in which I found this artist Kadiya Rupa Kachra, on whom I'll be speaking broadly. I'll give you a glimpse, but of course I've authored a chapter in the 3rd volume. So, I mean, if you want the exact full chapter, of course, you need to buy and read the book. But we could just start that, say, in this early 19th century painting, or I mean, rather late 19th century painting, we have this inscription, which I find, I mean, the inscription I find more fascinating is that not only it has the name of the artist, but it also tells us where he belongs to. So he's very particular. He's telling us Ravashi Jamnagar, which means I am, like, you know, Jamnagar is where he lives, and he gives a very particular date, and then tells us that this painting was commissioned by someone named Balotyana Patel, Kala Satan Patel, and from Limdi, which is an administrative unit in Gujarat. And certain inscriptions are not readable, so I mean, unfortunately, I could only make out some information, but he also uses the term Padraveche, which is offering it possibly, of course, in all likelihood, to a temple. into a Swaminarayan temple particularly. So we find an artist in late 19th century, early 20th century who is active and working for the Swaminarayan sect. And also a little bit about Swaminarayan sect before I move ahead, that it was a sect founded by someone named Sahajanand Swami in early, 1801, but the visual culture sort of develops much later, and it's pretty vast. Even that remains to be completely studied. But there are prints, there are paintings, there are puja boxes. It's a whole lot of visual material which sort of is waiting to be discovered or rather studied. And this is just one fraction of what I'll be speaking. And what here is just two examples. The left one is thought to be the earliest painting of the Swaminarayan sect by Narayan Suthar. And I will address the question of non-religious and religious art, but also to highlight that a lot of painters and our idea of painters and artists is a lot different and Eurocentric than what we could think of, like say Narayan Suthar and the Suthar family. They were originally carpenters, and they slowly developed into doing a lot of things. So we don't have full information, but we certainly know that they did wood carving, especially wood carving, and then they also shifted to painting. So, I mean, this idea of artist is actually very fluid in pre-modern South Asia. So even colonial world, so we need to sort of be very careful in placing them. And here, of course, the term still remains a bit loose and less studied, but certainly it just opens the debate and complex idea of who and what an artist is. So we move ahead. Yeah. Interestingly, the Swaminarayan sect is one of those sects, like say the Vallabhacharya sect or Pushti Marg, in which images are given crucial importance. So in Pushti Marg, you have this concept of Chitra Seva, wherein paintings are elevated to the status of sculpture. And so you put the paintings and you worship them, you clean them, and that is called Chitra Seva. And similarly, in Swaminarayan temples, even in private worship, paintings and prints are quite regularly used. So here is an image from the Kalupur temple in Ahmedabad, wherein these are three large paintings of a later painter who followed Kadiya Rupa Kachra. And I hope I'll give you a glimpse of why and how Kadiya Rupa Kachra in this broader network of colonial painters becomes very important. So to think through Kadiya Rupa Kachra, and especially before even that, colonial period court painting is actually very poorly studied. The historiography tells us, like, often scholars have dismissed as just copies of European art and just juxtaposing Western perspective. But recent scholarship, especially say Molly M. Aitken, Dr. Molly M. Aitken, she talks about Chotu and Rahim, who are from Bikaner. And they are the two painters who sort of are making paintings in different styles. So to think of painters as just sort of puppets is, I think, a very dated approach. And so new scholarship encourages us to think through what colonial world would be like in terms of visual culture. And so in this painting, which is possibly the earliest painting I found of Kadiya Rupa Kachra, was dated 1880. And he paints it here. He also, again, as you'll notice, most of his paintings are quite fully inscribed, which I won't say is very rare, but you certainly don't find it very often among painters. But he is very particular, so he'll give you almost full information about the date of the painting or who made it. So here it's written A Subi. Again, Subi is a very local Gujarati term with corruption of, say, Chabi and say Savi. And then again, these are intermingling words which are often used in Mughal courts, also in Rajput courts. But you think through that this painting is actually based on a photograph. And we don't know the exact photograph, but we know that this is certainly based on a photograph. And this is what Dr. Aitken also talks about, wherein this juxtaposition of, as you know, photography is arriving, a lot of artists are moving around. So there is a lot of demand of European fashion in the sense that you face the viewer, the frontal gaze becomes very important. So Rupa Kachra, Kadiya Rupa Kachra, what he does is makes this very realistic kind of face, and also the very realistic jewels. And as compared to the face and the upper section, when you see the hands, they appear slightly different, and also the color scheme changes. So you do see that, I won't say the artists are struggling, but certainly they are making a new genre, new style, which becomes very important. And at the same time, he's seated on a European chair. So, as I said, European fashion, European elements are in place. So we move to the next, where in the same painting, the painting actually refers to Dolotsav. Now, Dolotsav is a Vaishnav festival wherein Krishna swings. So this idea of adopting from Vaishnavism, of course, Swami, to define Swaminarayan sect is actually pretty complex, but to also think through, it's essentially a Vaishnav sect, wherein it picks up elements from, say, Ramanujacharya of Sri Vaishnavism. It also picks up elements from Vallabhacharya, the Pushti Marg sect, as I'm talking about, and then Dolotsav, this swinging, which often happens during Holi. And it actually is sometimes it's very erotic in nature, or sensuous in nature, wherein Krishna swings with gopis also and makes love. So here, the Swaminarayan sect is actually a very arguably and quote unquote very ascetic kind of sect, wherein Swaminarayan himself was an ascetic, he never married, but and he left like legacy of, say, his disciples and all, but he was the prime person in the sect. And so the painter sort of removes the sensuous and Shringara aspect and replaces it with, say, these formal elements, wherein he's, on the left and right, there are two guards. And more than that, it actually refers to a specific event which happened in reality. So that, and we know that only because certain, the good part about the Swaminarayan sect is that we have a lot of literary evidence, historical and literary evidence. So which one of the poems and also evidence tells us that this happened during and right among mango trees. So of course, I'm not saying that we need to take it quite literally how the painter makes it, but certainly the painter is aware of how to make it and what to do about it. And the text also, I think it's a verse which also mentions the two guards. So that makes it a sort of semi-realistic approach wherein Rupa Kachra is well aware of what is happening with Swaminarayan, or has happened, because Rupa Kachra is much later than Swaminarayan. And as you will see, these clouds which become his sort of signature motif, these curved snail-like clouds, sort of bulky figures, an extreme decoration in gold, which is also later on used by other Swaminarayan painters. But what becomes most important is that the inclusion of frontal face, because before this, I think I might have go back. Yeah. So before this, profile was in fashion. And what Kadiya Rupa Kachra does is brings in this element of frontality, wherein now the god is giving very direct darshan to the viewer. And there was one interesting anecdote that when I did my fieldwork and I visited quite a few Swaminarayan temples, there was one, I got lucky, there was one senior monk, and I was in such a rush that I forgot to ask his name, but we had a long chat for half an hour, and he told me that, these paintings, like he was referring to a painting of Kadiya Rupa Kachra, and told me that, the god has become very accessible to me now, very approachable to me now in Gujarati. And that anecdote I found very fascinating, that how a painter can bring in a lot of change in how the sect views the god. So from profile to directly viewing at the viewer. And then this other painting, which is sort of jam-packed with figures, and also it names everyone, and it has Bhakts, Hari Bhakts, which are like the devotees of the Swaminarayan sect are called Hari Bhakts. Acharyas, basically, who are the ones heading there are different gadis, different houses of Swaminarayan sect. It's very complex and large, but these are the heads, acharyas. And here are the musicians and saints also, which you see, and then bodyguards. Now, what Kadiya Rupa Kachra does is sort of jam packs everything and makes sure this triangular approach, wherein the central aspect is Swaminarayan seated in the center, and he makes him bulky, which is a very conventional idea of, again, portrait, quote unquote, portrait of Swaminarayan, wherein makes this very subtle mustache, a very clear halo. So you have an idea that, okay, he is the god. These are symbols which art historians read, and paintings also tell us more. And then there are chandeliers, which are very typical colonial chandeliers. You see that. And most importantly, something which is rather hidden is the European chair. And how I read it is that Swaminarayan sort of is imposing his divinity and his power over Europeans by sitting on a European chair. Because this idea of seating on a European chair itself became very crucial for Maharajas. And so, as I'm talking about shifting between the courtly and divine, you'll hopefully see and understand what I'm trying to say is that painters are in constant conversation with each other. Like as we've been discussing, it's not just one painter limiting to a religious sect. I mean, that also might happen, but painters are in conversation by working different places. So Kadia Rupa Kachra, as we will move on, he works also for the Jamnagar, for the Jam Sahib. So here is not a very clear picture, but still a very clear an understanding of this equestrian portrait of Sajana Swami, the one or Swami Narayan. And this is a very typical motif in Indian painting, wherein equestrian portraits of rulers going with chhatri behind is extremely common. It's most common. And when you see it, this inclusion of Swaminarayan as this wealthy, very elite figure roaming around, that becomes very crucial to understand how Kadiya Rupa Kachra is well aware of, say, court paintings. And again, the clouds, as I talked about, they keep reappearing. And so that gives me some confidence to attribute certain paintings which are, say, not signed to Kadiya Rupa Kachra. But of course, this is preliminary, so a lot remains to be done. And when you compare it with this, which is actually a print, I don't know where the original painting is now, but thanks to Dr. Robbins, we do have an idea. So this is Bahadur Khan of Junagadh. So now the sheer similarity between two figures, even the horse, the bulky horse, the figures, and also relatively similar clouds, not the same, makes me wonder whether it's either Kadiya Rupa Kachra himself or a close follower, or is it an artist who is following the style of Kadiya Rupa Kachra? So it becomes very interesting to think that the style, so-called the style of one artist, revolves and becomes popular, which makes us further think that just imagine that one artist has had a pretty huge impact in different courts or regions to be able to communicate that his style is popular across different domains. So you shift from divine to courtly and courtly to divine. This I think this fluidity has to be there, is there, and I think in scholarship we acknowledge it more and more now that we need to look at paintings in continuum rather than just assuming that they are different worlds. Next, just almost the end. We are just finishing. As I've been talking about, say saintly figures or divine figures. And when I say divine here, I'm meaning largely saints and say heads of sects. Here you have Dauji, who was one of the most famous actually Goswamis of the Pushtimarg sect. And Dauji is known for his fancy lifestyle. A lot has been written, and there are quite a few paintings where you see he's seated in a jharokha, gazing at a festival, which is very clear prototype of, say, a Rajput ruler seated on a jharokha. So here he's painted in the wall, on the wall of Kota Fort, when he's riding an elephant. So it gives a very elite look. Too often in the historiography of Nathdwara painting, he was from Nathdwara. Early scholarship actually, when they couldn't identify Dauji, they would write Prince riding a horse or Prince riding an elephant. So this sheer similarity between identifying yourself as God is actually prevalent across the world, but altogether more in India or South Asia, when say in Kishangarh you have Maharaja Savan Singh, who identifies himself as Krishna, and his lover Bani Thani, who is often portrayed as Radha. So that is just one example, and this is just another example from Nathdwara. But just two examples are enough to at least make us think how complex and how common, so to speak, it was. And from there, I shift to almost this end of this most important painting, wherein this is actually a Ras Mandal of Swaminarayan, wherein what does happen is that Kadiya Rupa Kachra, especially when making this Ras Leela, he replaces, if this echoes something, this is very clearly Krishna Radha doing dance. And Sharat Purnima, during Sharat Purnima, which is actually when Krishna and Radha, and I mean also gopis, Krishna multiplied. There's a divine episode wherein Krishna multiplies himself to dance with all the gopis. And there is one more interesting anecdote that Shiva also was so enamored by it that Shiva also wanted to enter the Ras Leela. But as he was not allowed, he was a male, so he changes his gender and becomes a gopi and comes to join the Ras Leela. So to come back to the Swaminarayan sect, here Swaminarayan multiplies himself. And instead of gopis, you have the acharyas and the haribhaks or the devotees. And very skillfully, Kadiya Rupa Kachara replaces, let's say, this painting. And this is just one example. There are numerous such Ras Leela examples painted in Bundi, Kota, Kishangarh. But Nadwara is the closest. And there are further connections with Swaminarayan sect, which we can discuss later on. But there is a very close visual ties between Nathdwara painters coming to Gujarat and working for Swaminarayan sect and then going back. When you see the large difference is again the removal of Shringar Ras or the aspect of eroticism, because now this becomes very aesthetically divine. It becomes very different. So Kadiya Rupa Kachra, what essentially I'm trying to say is that a painter who is very well aware of how to make the difference, to understand the context and to change the context. And which also makes me repeat the same line which I said earlier, is that painters are in constant conversation with each other, whether directly, indirectly. And this idea of copying in South Asia, say Nakal, was very popular, wherein a painter would say, look at a painting, say his ancestral painting, say if my father was an artist, and I'm, say, by copying his painting, I'm honoring him. And of course, that is one of the reasons, but other reasons also include that if you are a student of a famous painter or any painter, you will copy. And even now, if you're an artist, you would realize that you do end up copying a lot of paintings or say copying certain motifs to grasp ideas. And so Kadiya Rupa Kachra in this process does something absolutely breathtaking when he is very consciously changing roles. And that is, again, we only know very little of Kadiya Rupa Kachra. Whatever I could do was just a year-long bits and bits of fieldwork, because after that pandemic hit, so I couldn't do much. But so, I mean, to conclude, we've sort of peeked into Kadiya Rupa Kachra's life, his sort of style, and how he responded to certain sects in different areas. But sort of why is he so crucial, at least for now, in studying Gujarati painting? Because what does happen is that in this colonial context, Rupa or Kadiya Rupa Kachra is one of the few painters we know of who worked both for the courtly and the divine. And thankfully, we have certain records of how he did it. Like the inscriptions are enough to tell us, but also to remind you the frontality. So he's the painter for the Swaminarayan sect who actually introduced the frontal face. And so he becomes this Adarsh. In one of the actual literary evidence, there's a very interesting reference of calling him an Adarsh Chitara, which is an ideal artist. So he becomes this very crucial painter wherein after him, there are painters who follow him. And also think that this is the time of photography. So photography is already pumping in. Maharajas are interested in it. Even Swaminarayan sect is interested in it. So there is so much material flowing in that a painter active in a colonial world is a lot more complex than, say, even 17th, 18th centuries. And here is the painter Ishwar Jhaver Bhai Mistry, who was from Gadada. And one of the lineages of the painters. So he follows Kadiya Rupa Kachra and becomes the second most important artist. And remember again the frontality, this sheer frontality of how Swaminarayan very directly looks at the viewer becomes very important. And that makes me wonder how, say, the monks continue to think of their relationship, their ideal relationship with a god, wherein the painting becomes, as the monk talked about with me during the fieldwork, very approachable, very accessible. And just to end, here are some more information I could cull out through different records, through different books, and also largely a lot is based on fieldwork, because I interviewed a lot of monks, quite a few senior monks, and so a lot is oral records, of course. I don't want to get into the debate or just think that, okay, written text is more important than oral, but certainly we know that Kadiya's father, Rupa Kachra's father, Kachra Mandan, was a state carpenter in Jamnagar Court, and his brother Madha Kachra was the one who taught him painting, because Rupa Kachra, through whatever little we know, was more into wood carving, and Madha Kachra taught him painting. And then later on, you have other painters also who are working. Another one important painter whom we don't know much about is Kadiya Dama Ganga. And he is one painter who also made, at least we know of, one dated portrait of a Goswami of Nadwara, and that is painted in Jamnagar. So I know I'm leaving you with a lot of material to think through, but that's what is the idea, that it's so complex that we are only at the beginning of working on Gujarat. And I hope there is more material which flows out, more scholarship which comes out. So I hope this was enough, and I'm open to questions and reflections. And I'm happy to go back to a painting if you want to look at.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think it was a fantastic talk, Vineet. And I believe we need to talk more about such artists, for they actually take us to the real way in which the art and actually I'm a historian, so when we write history, we often tend to imagine the way things would have happened. And when you have some amount of corroboration in these paintings, then there is a validation that a historian requires. And often we feel very happy to see that such validation found in such artworks. So continuing with the question and answer. So there are some interesting questions that have been, I think you can read from the...
Yeah, should I take up the earlier questions?
Yes, please. Yes.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, I'm going to add a few points. I had noted them down while Dr. Robbins was talking about Tambikar Vada. Again, this is all in continuum with religious, non-religious, and painters traveling. We know that Kota and Nadwara artists came to Baroda and painted certain paintings on the walls. The Krishna Leela scenes are done. It's a very interesting style, wherein this eclecticism in artisans making in Kota style, Nadwara style, even so-called Maratha style, which is something new, which new scholars are looking at. As Dr. Robbins was talking about Kutch, Kutchi Pichwais, which are very less known, often are embroidered, and they also remain to be studied. And I mean, that also has been puzzling to me, that the sect of Srinathji or Vallabhacharya sect is actually the largest amount of devotees are Gujaratis, when you think of it, in Western India. And they go to Rajasthan, I mean to Nathdwara the most often. And interestingly, only Nathdwara painting as a center has been studied, but nothing in terms of how Gujarat responded to the Srinathji sect remains to be looked up, and I've been sort of doing some field work around it. So let's hope something comes out. The question regarding, there was one question about cave paintings, and I think I can recommend a broader survey book, 2 books. One is by Meera Seth. I think it's called Indian Wall Paintings or Wall Paintings of India. Again, it's a survey book, so you may not find it as enriching, but the other is Erwin Neumeyer. I can type it out. That is one book I read when I did my undergrad. I read that book for cave paintings in India, and the other was Meera Seth. So I hope that helps. The other was there was one also question about religious and non-religious art. So these boundaries are the ones which are made by colonial world and even us present scholarship, because as we've been discussing, artists are not like, you give me work and I'm going to work for you, whether you are Hindu, Muslim, or whether you are head of a sect, or whether you are a Maharaja. So we need to also think through in a very, I'm not saying a contemporary lens, but certainly, and more than that, artists are already migrating. They continue to migrate. Like there is a Mughal painter, I mean, a Rajput painter named Dalchand, who works for the Jodhpur Maharaja and then goes to Kishangarh, and then also works in Mughal India. So, it's a whole lot of artistic material which is flowing out. And one more important, as we've been talking about Hindu and Muslim, so to speak, one important so-called Muslim artist is Saibdin of Mewar in late 17th century, who makes a great range of paintings and is well known for his work. So, I mean, these are only a few examples, but I would encourage you to break the boundary or binary of this religious, non-religious, courtly and divine, even though I use it, but when you read the chapter, you realize how fluid that is. The other question was regarding, were there paintings made for which showcase Shringaras? Absolutely. You need to read eroticism or Shringaras or sensuality in a certain way. Like this idea of making love is again very fluid, wherein you will see a Nayak, Nayika, or this ideal hero, heroine, which are juxtaposed with Krishna and Radha making love. And one interesting painter which you might like is Chokha, who was active in early 19th century in Mewar. And he worked for the Devgarh Thikana, which was a small feudal state, and also Udaipur fort. So he was what Molly Aitken calls specialized in making erotic sentiment, bringing the sensual aspects. So I hope that helps. Now I'll take up the questions on what I have written. So there's one question: what was the reason for side profiles during the earlier times of a very complex and almost an unanswered, question which is a debate. Some scholars think that profile remained a fashion. Some scholars think that it sort of conveyed the person's because often certain paintings or people did not want to be, it was not this idea of photography. They didn't want to be seen that they are being painted. So they would look here. But again, we don't have actually one answer. One broader answer which scholars think is, yes, it was a convention, so to speak. But again, that remains a debate and open to interpretations and questions. Is Narayan Suthar the only contemporary? Yes, I mean, he, at least in my knowledge, he was the earliest and the only artist. And then there are other artists also, but we know, at least through dated examples, there is one that painting is actually inscribed with Narayanji Suthar's name. In fact, there's a very interesting anecdote. There's a verse in Gujarati which says that Narayanji Suthar, like Swami Narayan, sat on a gadi to get himself painted. And while Narayanji Suthar was making his portrait, he got a call to go out and preach. And so he leaves, but Narayanji Suthar was a very clever artist. So he sort of made an outline of a portrait, a rough sketch of Swaminarayan. And then later on, he finished it. So again, these are often enmeshed with, say, verses or devotional references, but I would think of them as sort of catalyst wherein it helps us to at least understand what was happening. And yeah, thank you for the comment. Someone has asked, halo around the divine figure is how. So yes, it was, this idea of halo was equally prevalent. We know that, I think, halo, I mean, again, remains open to debate, but scholars think that halo or nimbus became more common and arrived in India or in Mughal court, especially during during Jahangir's time, and it became very prevalent. But of course, you do find it in certain Akbari paintings also. So yes, it was actually a very prevalent notion of having a halo around. And that's when, you break the binary, because you identify as God or also the most powerful person, because halo is a medium. It's actually a tool wherein you use and tell others that, okay, I'm more important than the others. But it, of course, they both mean sometimes from case to case different meanings in different courts, different sects. So, one has to be specific to understand how they function. So Kishangarh night skies. I don't know if this is a question, but I mean, comment is that Kishangarh is influenced by Bundi paintings, night skies, and Mughal paintings. Okay, it's not a question, but I don't agree, because Kishangarh and Bundi paintings are quite different. Of course, stylistically, artists meet each other, and there are references, but Kishangarh with his is known for this fish-shaped eye and was quite different than, I mean, these styles are different yet similar. I mean, I won't put them into the binary of Mughal is different and Rajput is different. So it's actually very complex. But in my opinion, Kishangarh, Bundi, Mughal, you will be, after a point, if you study, you will figure out that they are quite different in their approach.
Yep. And also the fish eye is only later at the time of Seven Singh, where the early painting associated with the artists Bhawani Das and Dal Shad have no fish eye in their Kishangarh paintings, which show the Mughal links, because these people were very heavily into the Mughal court.
Okay, so there is another question by Gitika Rathore. So she asks, is there a difference between the art or paintings patronized by the Mughals and the rulers of the princely states? So is there
did I miss it? Was it earlier?
Yeah, it was earlier.
Oh, okay. I mean, it depends what you're referring to, because princely states is a colonial, I mean, it's again, as from the beginning we talked about that it's a term which is already so difficult and complex. But I mean, I think there are differences between how Mughals and Rajput courts, or even any other courts, say, were getting paintings made, and you will find it very clearly often, but also not very often. So it's very erratic. I mean, there's no one answer of understanding that, yes, there is a difference, but also the world is too small. I mean, as Dr. Robbins talked about Dalchan, and as I also mentioned, Dalchan works in Jodhpur, Kishangarh, and his style changes. And you do see that. And in sometimes artists travel in to different courts and their styles may not change. So it all depends on how an artist is working. But in its core essence, the Mughal and Rajput world was already genetically, visually, materially, like it was too connected. So we can't break them apart. So even if there are differences, there would be large similarities. And I think one book which you could look at, which will actually help you answer these questions, is it's a seminal book on Rajput painting, Intelligence of the Tradition. I'm just typing it out. And Rajput painting. So this is actually the kind of questions which you are asking these are the ones which so possibly may help you to think through, because she deals with formal qualities and a lot more, and talks about how the tradition has its own importance, and also terms like style or say kalam, and how do we think of them. So, I mean, I highly recommend going through this book.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we're going to talk about Hindu-Muslim things, the question of the Radhanpur paintings is particularly important, because what it really shows us is that the styles that were used in that Muslim court were not necessarily different than those that would have been used in a Hindu court. And I think that we're very much too much involved on seeing the differences between things. It's easier, you feel like you're smarter. I think I call it the principle of Rumpelstiltskin, when you can put a name on something or label something or say that this is an 1820 painting from Jamnagar, then you feel like you're smarter than other people, but it's a false thing. And I think that the major problem that we have in art is really that, as was pointed out, that the so-called Indian artist very often came where Tarkhans and the Pahari Hills and in these areas were carpenters and other things, and were seen as artisans and not artists. The question is, who determines whether somebody's an artist? Is it Akbar saying that this person is the artist of his generation, as part of a Persianate tradition, or is it the art collector who, I mean, I'm looking at a painting, that I think is beautiful in my collection, and the average person is going to pass it by and say, what kid drew it? They don't really realize the quality of the painting at all.
Sure. So before we close, so there's this interesting, what I suddenly realized is that the name of the artist is very interesting. It is Kadiya Rupa Kachra. So you had shown us the genealogy, and Kadiya, if we translate it, It is, I think, if I'm not wrong, it is the daily wager or daily laborer is known as a kadiya. Then you have the term rupa, and then you have the term kachra. It's very interesting as to how, because often people camouflage behind, they hide behind names, and it is, somebody saying kadiya is a mason, so it's the one who builds the walls and everything. So have you really found out as to what sort of a relationship, or what sort of a, what kind of let's say caste or community they came from, and why would they call themselves that?
Yeah, I mean, I could find certain clues in Jamnagar's history that, as again, for us, the term kadiya in contemporary Gujarati is mason, but we don't know what it meant in 19th century. So, we might have to be careful in just assuming that it's a mason. But at least through surviving examples and whatever little we know, yes, either they were carpenters, the family was a carpenter family, or a mason family, and then they did some, the Jam Sahib actually gave 500 rupees to, this portrait which I showed of Jam Sahib, which was sold at Christie's, that there was a similar painter, there's a record, we don't know, but there was a similar portrait which Kadiya Rupa Kachra made, and the Jam Sahib was so happy that he gave him 500 rupees to build a Swaminarayan temple. So caste certainly is a very crucial aspect when you think of painters, and as I've been contemplating over it, most of the painters, when you start thinking, they do come from a lower strata of the society, but it's still very difficult. I don't want to generalize.
This is what I was getting at. So essentially, when we talk about the caste system, quote unquote, once again, we have been fed this whole issue, this whole idea of caste system as an inherent to the Indian social structure by the Westerners, by the Europeans. So it's not, I'm not saying that there was no caste system, or there was no such, there were no such structures present, but the way in which we read about them and we write about them, I think these very examples clearly showcases that we need to revisit even the caste, the idea of a caste. Because to say that when we talk about the lower caste groups, we often sense that they were not allowed to, touch the temple wall, or maybe even move around the vicinity of the temple. And here you have examples of people belonging to the lower caste groups. They were being commissioned to draw a painting on a temple wall. So again, this also should be, I think the idea of caste system, the rigidity of the caste system also should be relooked at, is what I feel. Because these are the methods through which we have to revise what we already know about history. So I think it's a very interesting lecture. I think it has given us a lot to think. So I think we already have ran out of our time. Thank you very much, Mr. Vyas, for joining. Yes. Dr. So I think thank you very much for joining today, this evening.
Thank you for so kindly inviting me. This was amazing. I got to talk about Gujarat, which I've been hoping to. So thank you, Dr. Robbins, Dr. Sabnis, and also the Asiatic Society. I had fun doing this.
Thank you, the Asiatic Society.
Good evening to all of you. Good night, and very good day to you, Ken. And thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.